a painful memory. I remember the first time I saw her. It was a warm summer afternoon. The sun was bright and the air was fresh. I was sitting in the park with my best friend, David. We always went there after school. We talked about life, our dreams and the future. We laughed about silly things and made plans for the weekend. Everything felt simple and easy. But that day, something changed. As we sat on the bench, she walked past us. She had long, dark hair and bright eyes. She wore a yellow dress that moved with the wind. She looked like a dream, and for a moment the world felt different. David noticed her too. He smiled and said, "She is beautiful." I nodded, but I could not speak. My heart beat faster, and I did not know why. I had never felt this way before. It was new, exciting, and a little scary. I wanted to talk to her, but I did not know what to say. David was always more confident than me. He never felt nervous. While I sat there in silence, he stood up and walked toward her. I watched as he said hello. She turned to him and smiled. Her smile was warm and kind. They started talking, and I sat there, feeling something strange inside me. I did not know what it was. It was not anger, and it was not sadness, but it hurt. I wanted to be happy for David, but a small voice inside me whispered that I wanted to be the one talking to her. I pushed the thought away. David was my best friend. We had been friends since childhood. We always shared everything. But this was different. This was love. And love was not easy to share. Days passed, and we saw her again and again. Her name was Emily. She was kind and smart. She loved books and music. She had a soft voice that made everything feel calm. We talked to her every day after school. Sometimes we walked with her. Sometimes we sat in the park and listened to her stories. I liked every moment with her, but I also felt a quiet pain inside me. I did not know what she felt. Did she like David? Did she see me the same way I saw her? I never asked. I was too afraid of the answer. Then one day David looked at me and said, "I think I love her." His words hit me like a storm. I felt something break inside me, but I did not show it. I smiled and nodded. "She is amazing," I said. That was all I could say. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same. I wanted to tell him that every time I saw her, my heart felt full and empty at the same time. But I stayed silent. That day, I knew everything would change. After that day, something was different. David talked about Emily more often. He smiled when he said her name. He asked me if I thought she liked him. I always gave the same answer. "I don't know," I said, even when I wanted to say more. Every time he spoke about her, I felt my heart grow heavier. I wanted to be happy for him, but I couldn't. I wanted to tell him the truth, but I was too afraid. If I told him, everything would change. Our friendship would not be the same, and I was not ready to lose my best friend. Emily was always kind to both of us. She laughed at David's jokes, but she also listened to me when I talked. She asked me about my favorite books and my dreams. She remembered the little things I told her. Sometimes when she smiled at me, I felt like I was the only person in the world. But I never let myself believe it meant something. Maybe she was just being nice. Maybe she smiled at David the same way. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. One afternoon, the three of us sat by the river. The sun was setting, and the sky was full of colours. It was a perfect moment, but I felt anything but happy. David was sitting close to Emily. He looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. And she didn't move away. They looked like they belonged together, and I was just there, watching. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I wanted to speak, but I had nothing to say. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My heart felt heavy. I thought about Emily's smile, her voice, the way she made me feel. I thought about David, my best friend, who had always been by my side. I thought about how unfair it was that love could feel so good and so painful at the same time. I wanted to forget my feelings. I wanted to pretend they did not exist. But no matter how hard I tried, they were still there. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling did not go away. Every time I saw Emily, my heart felt warm. Every time I saw her with David, my heart felt cold. I lived between these two feelings, not knowing what to do. Should I tell her? Should I tell David? Or should I stay silent and let things happen as they were meant to? I did not know the answer. I only knew one thing. This was not going to be easy. I tried to hide my feelings, but it was not easy. Every day, I saw Emily and David together. They laughed, talked, and walked side by side. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I could live with it, but deep inside, I knew I was lying. The more time they spent together, the more I felt like I was disappearing. I was there, but I was not really part of their world. I was just watching from the side, pretending I did not care. One afternoon, David and I sat on the school steps, waiting for Emily. The air was cool and the sky was grey. It felt like rain was coming. David was excited. He told me he was planning to ask Emily to be his girlfriend. He had been thinking about it for weeks. He wanted it to be special. He wanted to take her to her favourite cafe and give her a small gift. He asked me if I thought it was a good idea. I smiled and said, yes. My voice was steady, but inside I felt like I was falling. I knew this moment would come. I knew David would tell her how he felt, but knowing did not make it easier. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to say, wait, I love her too. But I said nothing. I let him talk about his plans while I nodded and smiled. The words I wanted to say stayed inside, locked away where no one could hear them. That evening, I walked home alone. The streets were empty, and the wind was cold. I felt small, like a shadow moving through the world. I thought about David and Emily. I imagined them together, smiling, happy. The image hurt more than I expected. I told myself I should be happy for them. David was my best friend. He deserved happiness. But why did his happiness feel like my loss? The next day, David met Emily after school. I did not go with him. I could not watch. I walked in the opposite direction, my heart heavy. I told myself it was better this way. I did not want to see her say yes. I did not want to see them walk away together. So I left, hoping that if I did not see it happen, it would not feel real. That night, I waited for David's message. I waited to hear that she had said yes, that they were together now, but no message came. The hours passed, and my phone stayed silent. A small hope grew inside me, but I did not know if I was ready to face what it meant. Something had happened, and I was afraid to find out what it was. The next morning, I saw David at school. He looked different. His usual bright smile was gone. His shoulders were low, and his eyes looked tired. I knew something had happened, but I didn't ask right away. I waited for him to speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. He told me he had talked to Emily. He had told her how he felt, and she had not given him the answer he wanted. I felt my heart beat faster. "What did she say?" I asked, trying to sound normal. David sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "She said she likes me," he said. "But she doesn't love me. Not in that way." His words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I didn't know how to respond. A part of me felt relief. Another part of me felt guilty for feeling that way. David tried to act like it didn't hurt, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He had always been confident, always sure of himself, but now he looked lost. "I thought she felt the same," he said. "I really did." I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I also knew that nothing I said would change how he felt. Love was not something you could fix with words. For the next few days, things were strange between us. David was quiet. He didn't joke around as much. He didn't talk about Emily anymore. But even without saying her name, I knew he was thinking about her, and I was thinking about her too, but for a different reason. I wondered if this meant I had a chance. If she didn't love David, did that mean she could love me? The thought made my chest feel tight. One afternoon, I saw Emily alone in the library. She was reading, her fingers resting lightly on the pages. She looked peaceful, but when she saw me, she smiled. "Hey," she said softly. I sat down across from her, my heart beating fast. We talked about books, about school, about little things that didn't really matter. But under the surface, there was something else, something unspoken. I wanted to ask her about David, about what had happened, but I didn't. I was afraid of the answer. As I walked home that evening, my thoughts were tangled. David was hurt. Emily was still the same, kind and warm, and I was stuck in the middle, unsure of what to do. A part of me wanted to stay away, to avoid making things worse, but another part of me wanted to take a step forward. I just didn't know which path was the right one. Days passed, but the silence between David and me remained. We still sat together in class. We still walked home on the same streets, but something had changed. He didn't laugh as much. He didn't talk about Emily, and I didn't bring up her name either. We acted like everything was normal, but we both knew it wasn't. It felt like a wall had grown between us, and neither of us knew how to break it down. Emily, on the other hand, was the same. She smiled when she saw me. She asked about my day. She still laughed at my jokes, and sometimes when she spoke, I thought I saw something in her eyes, something soft, something real. But I told myself it was just my imagination. I didn't want to hope for something that wasn't there. One afternoon, as I sat alone under a tree behind the school, Emily found me. She sat beside me, close enough that I could hear her steady breathing. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me and said, "You've been quiet." Her voice was gentle, but her words carried weight. I wanted to tell her everything, to explain the storm inside me, but I didn't know how. Instead, I sighed and said, "A lot has been on my mind." She nodded, as if she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe she knew exactly what I meant. "I never wanted to hurt David," she said after a moment. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. But I couldn't lie to him. I looked at her then, really looked at her. She wasn't just kind, she was honest. And that made me admire her even more. I wanted to ask her more, to know if she had feelings for someone else, but I was too afraid of the answer. Instead, we sat there in silence, watching the wind move through the trees. For a moment I let myself enjoy it, the simple act of being near her. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I would remember this moment forever. That evening I saw David standing near my house. He looked like he had been waiting for me. When I walked up to him, he took a deep breath and said, "We need to talk." His voice was calm, but his eyes held something deep, something I couldn't read. I nodded, my heart pounding. I knew this conversation would change everything. I just didn't know how. David stood in front of me, his hands in his pockets, his eyes serious. The air between us felt heavy. I wanted to speak, to ask him what was on his mind, but I waited. I knew this moment was important. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "I know." His voice was calm, but there was something else in it, something I couldn't ignore. I felt my stomach tighten. "Know what?" I asked, even though I already had an idea. David gave a small, tired smile. "That you like her," he said simply. The words hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something that would make this easier. But I couldn't lie. Not to him, not any more. For a moment we just stood there, letting the truth settle between us. Then David sighed and looked away. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he continued. "At first I was angry, not at you, just at everything. I thought Emily and I would be something more. I thought she could love me the way I loved her." He shook his head. "But she didn't, and that's not your fault." I didn't know what to say. I'd been preparing for the worst, for anger, for a fight, for our friendship to fall apart. But David wasn't angry. He was hurt, but he wasn't blaming me. That made it even harder. "I never wanted to hurt you," I finally said. My voice was quiet, but I meant every word. "I know," he said. "That's why I can't be mad at you." He looked at me again, his eyes clearer now. "I won't lie. It still hurts. But I don't want to lose my best friend over this." His words caught me off guard. I had spent weeks feeling guilty, expecting to lose him. But here he was, standing in front of me, choosing our friendship over everything else. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "So, what now?" I asked. David shrugged. "Life goes on," he said. "Maybe it'll be weird for a while. Maybe we'll both need time. But in the end, we're still friends. That matters more than anything." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. We stood there for a few more minutes, neither of us in a rush to leave. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the street. It felt like an ending, but also like a new beginning. I didn't know what would happen with Emily. I didn't know if she would ever see me the way I saw her, but for the first time in a long time, I knew that whatever happened, I wouldn't have to face it alone.